Hello and welcome. In this session, you will learn how Dockerizing SQL Anywhere 17 ODBC client with REST API and PowerServer 2021 projects. A step-by-step approach that will teach you how to configure ODBC connection in Docker engine, how to configure Docker image, and how to configure SnapDeveloper for Docker deploy. The first exercise will target PowerServer 2021 projects, migrating the Appeon SalesDemo application. A second exercise will instead Dockerize a REST API project. A short disclaimer, as usual, for these contributions authored by volunteers in the Appeon community. And now the session agenda. I will start explaining why Docker and show how to configure ODBC connection in Docker engine. Then I will present how to configure the Docker image and turn to the gist of this session, how to configure SnapDevelop for Docker deploy, with the step-by-step for a PowerServer 2021 project. Take SalesDemo application and SQL Anywhere 17, which is available in Power Builder 2021, and deploy this SalesDemo app to PowerServer 2021, adding SQL Anywhere 17 ODBC library to connect the remote SalesDemo database. And then same exercise, but with REST API projects, in order to have its web API layer deployed to Docker engine. Talk about me for a very little bit. I'm a PowerServer enthusiast from the very early days and have migrated to the web and mobile architectures dozens of applications worldwide. I am Appeon MVP, active member on the community portal, and have been programming Power Builder since version 4.0. Lately, I have been involved in web front-end projects powered by REST API developed with SnapDevelop, and I've chosen Vue.js and Quasar as my favorite frameworks. I gave a long tutorial on this during last year Elevate. On the other hand, I have advanced studies in machine learning and big data, and I like to stay up to date on these matters. So let's start with why Docker. Well, Docker enables developers to easily pack, ship, and run any application as a lightweight, portable, self-contained component which can virtually run everywhere. And this will be the case for our SnapDevelop projects connecting SQL Anywhere 17 remote database. Containers do this by enabling developers to isolate code into a single container. This makes it easier to modify and update the program. You can see in this picture the primary difference between traditional deployment to virtual machines versus Docker engine, which is that containers provide a way to virtualize an operating system so that multiple workloads can run on a single operating system instance. With virtual machines, instead, the hardware is being virtualized to run multiple operating system instances. But this means that moving virtual machines across data centers on the cloud, if you think at platform like Azure, like AWS, will be harder than if you're using containers. Often the resources provided by virtual machines are too much for running a single application. Once a VM is assigned to a resource, it takes up the whole space even when it's not needed or when it needs less. So, first exercise is Dockerize the PowerServer 2021 project and add SQL Anywhere 17 support in the deployed container. So this is why the application that will be running as a container will be able to connect the remote DB. We can take the sales demo that is installed in PB 2021. First step is to create a PowerServer 2021 project. Of course, configure our clients, features, as well as the Cloud App Launcher. We are not going to discuss how to deploy PB app to PowerServer 2021 here, but important thing is the Web API panel in the PowerServer project, where to specify the Web API URL, which is hostname and port number exposed by Docker Engine when our container will be started. So this you must know in advance. Next, second step is only for dev machines. Don't confuse with remote database settings, which will be defined in a later step. Likewise, all PowerServer, the database connection settings are required for two things. So when connecting the Power Builder data window objects to C# models during the deployment process, and when accessing data from the database at application runtime. So the database information, including the cache settings and the transaction to cache mapping, will be deployed to the server API projects in the PowerServer C# solution. So here we specify the SQL Anywhere data store for cache name, and we call it sales. And below the static mapping between these sales cache name and the Power Builder transaction object used to refer the actual database, SQL CA. Next is to switch to SnapDevelop and configure silent installation for SQL Anywhere 17. Of course, everything must be transparent and run without any user interaction when you deploy a container. In particular, you need to adapt the server API project generated by PowerServer and add few files that will be used in the Docker file to build properly the Docker image so that our sales demo can run as a Docker container, but also have the proper driver to connect the remote DB, as well as perform driver installation silently so that everything will be transparent to users. So here, typical solution, PowerServer solution with a server API projects, and in yellow you see what our projects needs in addition, 1, 2, and 3. So a common .sh, common shell, which is our batch, a common file that contains commands to be run by Linux shell, because among the others we need to define ODBC driver and data source name for Docker image. An install shell, a second batch to run SQL Anywhere silent installation when we will create the Docker image. Last, from SAP website, download SQL Anywhere 17 developer for Linux distribution. So you will get a tarball, and that we must run silently via install sh in order later to have common shell file to find properly the database client. So let's now understand a little bit more in detail each of these three components, these three files. Let me start with common shell. Common shell is a batch whose purpose is to specify the ODBC settings to connect the remote database. If you read the SQL Anywhere 17 developer guide, what you need to do is to set up the ODBC data source name to create the odbc.ini file, and in there have a section with database client library, specify the IP and port number of the remote SQL Anywhere 17 database, which will be written in the odbc.ini in the Docker image. In fact, the bash script prepares a string in double quotes that will be written into /etc/odbc.ini. After that, we need to make executable with change mode plus X the saconfig shell script and run it, which will make the current instance to read the up-to-date SQL Anywhere environment variables. And finally, the .NET Server API.dll will actually run the .NET application, our REST API application DLL file. To run the REST API means to find and execute the entry point, which is the main method in our Server API project. So here you can better see how the generated odbc.ini looks like with driver, database name, server name, and comlinks property. The section name here is chosen to be as an Appeon sample for server, kind of naming convention inherited from older PowerServer web and mobile projects, but the point is to show you what is the ODBC data source name, which will need to set in the REST API database configuration file, namely in application.json. The actual remote database server name is instead ASA17 Docker, and database name is Power Builder Demo 2021. This is just standard setup in Sybase Central, where port number 5005 is also set, and this is the port number on host whose IP address is 10.211.55.7. Good. Let's now move to install shell. This is actually part of the SQL Anywhere 17 distribution, so nothing to do here. You can use it in case of silent installation. In short, it lists all questions you would get during a normal interactive installation, but it sends answer to skip all traditional installation wizard. You can see the send command at the end of each line with enter or yes or no or other answers. So this comes with the tarball distribution. Let's see now the Docker file. SnapDevelop can add Docker file, can add Docker support with right-click on the Server API project. A Docker file like this one, for those of you who may not have Docker knowledge, is a text document that contains all the commands a user could call on the command line to assemble an image. Now, to our purpose, Docker file generated by SnapDevelop must be extended with additional commands to take into account the three elements seen so far: command shell, install shell, and SQL Anywhere 17 tarball. So line 1 to 21 represents standard REST API Docker file, where base, ASP.NET, and .NET Core SDK are assembled in the image. Line 15, in fact, runs .NET build. This is a command to build a project and its dependencies into a set of binaries. And line 18 publishes the application and its dependencies to a folder, namely /app/publish for deployment to a hosting system. And new lines that we need are 23 with add instruction that copies new files from source and add them to containers file system at path destination. So the tarball is actually copied to current dir in the container file system. Similarly, the copy instruction at this line 24 copies to the containers file system the install shell that we know performs SQL Anywhere 17 Salin installation. And last is line 30 with entry point instruction that allows you to configure a container that will run as an executable. Namely, the common shell that we copied before here, and we know set the ODBC.ini, read SQL environment variables, and start our server API DLL with the main function as an entry point. Good. Next, before we build the image and run the container, of course, we must configure the database connection for the REST API. So when the API will be running in the web container, it opens a connection pool as specified in the application.json config file, where we must indicate the data source name as defined in the odbc.ini file, which, remember, was this ASA Appeon sample for server in this example. This is the ODBC name for database connection to remote SQL Anywhere 17. As I said, be sure the data source name match the section name in the odbc.ini. It's time now to actually build the image and start the container. So we give a name that will appear in the Docker engine, SalesDemo. We set the environment variable ODBC.ini as required by SQL Anywhere 17 documentation to define the ODBC.ini config file. We bind the HTTP port, for example, to a custom port, for example, 589, and that's it. Container is ready, as you can see bottom right here in the Docker Explorer from SnapDevelop. So what I did was just right-click on the SalesDemo image, and later the icon below is green, is telling you that the container is running. Quick test to check from a web browser whether our SalesDemo server API is running. We can, for example, call getSessionCount. It's a PowerServer API, and see if it returns value 0. This return value is the session counter, and of course we haven't yet active sessions, that's why it's 0, but that's enough. It's 0, so that means we have an answer from the running SalesDemo API started in a Docker container on port 589. Time now to actually start SalesDemo frontend. You can either start the application from Power Builder or as an installable cloud app by typing its URL in the web browser. So that the cloud app launcher will start and download the first time all client-side files, and then the application is started and automatically updated if necessary. Whenever you ask the data, for example, here the application started, click on the list of address, and whenever data is asked, because, for example, data retrieve occurs, or whenever you'd like to update the information on your screen, the PowerServer SalesDemo API running the Docker container is called. Now that you have learned how to Dockerize SQL Anywhere connection to your PowerServer 2021 project, we can certainly apply the same approach for a brand new REST API project, which consists of going through a typical 2 minutes exercise you have seen in many SnapDevelop tutorials. Most likely you pick up one of your favorite data window from an existing project, say the list of employees, from the same Power Builder demo database that is also used by Sales Demo application. From the data window, you generate the C# data model with right click and then scaffold service and controller, which is enough to run the employee REST API right away. But at this point, you want to deploy the API as a Docker container instead of running it in the default .NET Core Web Container from SnapDevelop. Therefore, we must add command shell, install shell, and SQL driver talboard to our REST API project. Add support to Docker and modify the Docker file as in the previous exercise. Build the image, run the container, and call the API on select Docker engine hostname and port number, and you will have the API able to connect to remote SQL Anywhere 17. A little recap on how your dev environment will look like to build the Docker image for this second exercise. Up here, Power Builder with traditional data window showing the list of employees, so the employee. Below, SnapDevelop with in yellow the controller generated from employee data model, and then command shell and to set up ODBC INI and run the server API DLL, install shell for silent installation of SQL driver, and Docker file that is shown on the right side here and we have discussed in detail before. And finally, it's time to start the container from SnapDevelop. On the left panel, you open the Docker Explorer and connect the Docker engine. Select the image built during the previous step and start it on given port number and with ODBC INI environment variable set to /etc/odbc.ini. Port number this time is 588. So right side, the browser is open and get request to retrieve the list of employees from the Power Builder REST API deployed to remote machine. This time, as I said, on port 588 because port 589 we have started previous sales demo API. We can now move on to the demo and show PowerServer sales demo and Power Builder demo REST API deployed as Docker containers and connecting the Power Builder demo SQL Anywhere 17 database running on a remote machine. Right, so here is my Windows Dev machine with Power Builder 2021 and the Sales Demo application that I want to deploy as a PowerServer project. Sales Demo application is available in PB21 at this path, and once you open it, you're ready to create a new PowerServer project. You select this icon, and you can fill the several tab pages I've already done here. In particular, it's important, the last one, the Web API. And here you can see that the app will connect the PowerServer at this Web API URL, which won't be, in my case, an actual host name, but a container in my Docker installation. So click on Build and Deploy the PowerServer project. This will end up with the front-end part of the installable cloud app deployed to whatever server we have specified in the client deployment, and the web API as a C# solution that you can open in SnapDevelop. That's the server API. And in here, we need to add the three components we have seen during the presentation. In fact, I have the command shell, the install shell, and the big tarball SQL 17 developer Linux, which is the entire client library for SQL Anywhere. I've added the three files to my project, so install shell, command shell, and the tarball, just to have a look how they look like and recap the situation. Maybe better if I open from Notepad. So the command shell, remember, is a batch that is going to store the configuration of the data source name. So it will create a string and it will echo the string into etc odbc.ini in the container file system. And then we will take the config shell from SQL Anywhere, which after getting the execution rights will be executed in order to prepare the SQL Anywhere environment, and finally the server API will be executed through the .NET command. Install shell. This is much simpler. You keep it as it is. So all the questions that you would get during an interactive installation of SQL Anywhere, but in this case, all these questions will be answered in silent mode. So it will be transparent to user with all the answers sent to the installer. And finally the tarball. So 1, 2, and 3. Once you're ready, you can add the Docker support to your project, and you will end up with this file, at least the initial part, from line 1 until line 18. Initially, you will build an image with ASP.NET, .NET Core SDK, and then add to the image are three files: the tarball, install shell, command shell. Then you will run some sanity check, so apt update, and install the Unix ODBC library, and of course run finally the install shell to actually install SQL Anywhere client library in the file system, in the container file system, and finally start the REST API through command shell. Ready to publish to build a Docker image. Of course, you need Docker, so that's why you can select View, Docker Explorer. I have already a Docker engine running on the remote machine, but if you don't have any installation, you can just click on localhost, and SnapDevelop will ask you whether you want to install Docker Desktop on your Windows machine. So, and everything will be automatic. So this is my remote Docker Desktop. And of course, as soon as I take my API, the Docker file, and click on Build a Docker image, I will be able to select the remote Docker engine. I will give a name to my image, for example, SalesDemo, click OK, and the image will be built. It will take a few minutes because, of course, it needs to fetch the .NET Core SDK, ASP.NET, all the things. In the end, the image will be here. Of course, you can run the image at this point as a container. The container gets here, and you start and stop. Good. So if the container is up and running, we are ready to go back to Power Builder and run the actual installable cloud app, the actual PowerServer project, either from Power Builder itself, or you open the web browser and you specify the ICA URL. I'll do it from here. And you will see the interface of the PowerServer demo, sales demo application will pop up. Let's get some data. List of address. This list is retrieved from the running container, which in turn has connected the remote SQL Anywhere 17 database. If you don't believe this data is coming from the container, we can start an HTTP proxy to debug, infect the traffic. So let's go back to the application and fetch some additional data. List of customers plus probably some drop-down data window. And here it is. That's the request that goes to the host name where the Docker is running. Remember, that's the same host name on port 589. And you can see the traffic. So the ICA front end has retrieved data into the deep person list data window, and the Docker container, the REST API running Docker container, have sent back the list of customers. So in the content result set, you will see there are plenty of data here. Next, we can run the REST API project. So a REST API which we can build from scratch in SnapDevelop. So let's start from Power Builder. As usual, I have a data window that shows the list of employees from the Power Builder PB demo database. And in SnapDevelop, I've just created from that data window, which is here, with the usual convert data window to C# model, to get the C# model, and then right click to scaffold service and controller in the usual 2 minutes exercise. So I've created a fully fledged REST API. Now this REST API is extended with the 3 files: command shell, install shell, and the SQL Anywhere 17 client library. You add Docker support, so that is your Docker file, and as usual, as before, you add to the container file system the 3 files, do the sanity check, and specify what is the entry point for the REST API. Take the Docker file, build the Docker image. This can be PB demo, and again to my remote Docker engine. Let's switch here. PB demo, that's the image. It's gonna take a couple of minutes. So here I have it already available, and then run as a container. Here it is, start Power Builder demo. And once my API is running on as a Docker container at this host name, port number is 588, I can just open the browser and specify host name, port number, API employees, and get the list of employees. But before doing that, if you haven't done it yet, please let me remind you to join the Appeon community portal. That's the place where you can find discussion, technical articles, videos, free online training, and more, and follow up on social networks. Thank you very much for your attention. Time now for a Q&A. We have about 10 minutes for chatting.